She served him coffee, he served her a shock. The billionaire's wallet held a secret about her mom. The fluorescent lights of the nearly deserted diner hummed, casting a sterile glow on the worn linoleum. Clara scrubbed at a stubborn coffee stain on the counter, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Tonight's tips were pathetic, barely enough to cover a fraction of the rent they'd loomed, a monstrous deadline just 2 days away. Despair tightened its icy grip around her heart. Then, the bell above the door sang, announcing a new arrival. He walked in like a storm of tailored power. A sharply dressed man, every inch the epitome of wealth and command. His suit probably cost more than she earned in a year, and his very presence seemed to warp the air around him. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she approached, forcing a smile. As she handed him the bill, a sleek leather wallet slipped open, and a photograph peeked out. It was a photo of her mother. Time stopped. The diner faded away. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely keep the bill steady. In a voice barely above a whisper, choked with disbelief, she managed, "Sir, why is my mother's picture in your wallet?" Before we start, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more powerful stories. Clara's breath hitched, a strangled gasp lost in the sterile air of the diner. The familiar photograph, tucked casually inside the billionaire's impossibly expensive wallet, seemed to mock her meager existence. Her mother's warm smile, frozen in time, stared back at her with an unnerving familiarity. It was impossible. Her mother had never breathed a word of knowing anyone this wealthy, anyone who moved in such rarefied air. Yet, here was undeniable proof, staring her in the face, that they were somehow connected. What secrets had her mother kept? The man, completely oblivious to the seismic shockwave that had just ripped through Clara's world, calmly retrieved his wallet. He placed a crisp $100 bill on the counter, a small fortune in Clara's current reality, and rose to leave. Panic surged through Clara, a desperate tide threatening to drown her. She couldn't let him walk away. Not without answers. "Excuse me, sir," she blurted out, her voice a desperate plea barely audible above the clatter of dishes in the kitchen. He paused, his movements deliberate, almost predatory. Turning, his piercing gaze swept over her, his blue eyes, sharp and unreadable, sent a shiver down her spine. "Yes," he asked, his tone indifferent, as if he had already dismissed her as insignificant. Clara swallowed hard, her hands clenched so tightly at her sides that her nails dug into her palms. "That picture, in your wallet, the woman in it, she's my mother." For the first time, something flickered in the billionaire's carefully constructed mask. A momentary hesitation, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, a flicker of recognition. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a blank, impenetrable wall of indifference. "You must be mistaken," he said smoothly, adjusting the cuff of his immaculate suit. The casual dismissal stung like a slap. Clara's stomach twisted into knots. She knew what she had seen. She had memorized every curve of her mother's face, every detail of that photograph, since childhood. It was an old picture, one her mother used to keep hidden away in a small, dusty box filled with other forgotten memories. A box she rarely opened, a past she rarely spoke about. "I'm not mistaken," she insisted, stepping closer, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a desperate need to understand. "Why do you have her picture?" The billionaire exhaled slowly, a sigh of barely concealed impatience, as if debating whether to dignify her question with a response. Then, without another word, without another flicker of emotion, he turned on his heel and walked toward the exit. Clara's pulse pounded in her ears, a frantic drumbeat urging her forward. She couldn't let him disappear. This was too important. This was about her mother. This was about her. Rushing out from behind the counter, she nearly knocked over a tray laden with dirty dishes, the clatter echoing like a gunshot in the suddenly silent diner. "Wait," she called, her voice cracking with desperation. He didn't stop. Didn't even falter. Her heart racing, fueled by adrenaline and a lifetime of unanswered questions, she followed him out into the chilly evening air. The street was quiet, the only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the lonely whistle of the wind. The billionaire approached a sleek, black car parked at the curb, its driver already stepping out to open the door. Clara reached him just as he was about to step inside. "Please," she pleaded, her voice raw with emotion. "Just tell me, how did you know my mother?" He paused, his hand resting on the cool metal of the car door. For a fleeting second, she thought he might answer, might offer some explanation, some crumb of truth. Instead, he turned slightly, his eyes scanning her face with a cold, calculating intensity. Something was unsettling about his stare, as if he was trying to dissect her, to determine whether she was worth his time, his effort, his what? Truth? Lies? Then, in a voice as cold and impersonal as the steel and glass buildings that lined the city skyline, he said, "I don't owe you an explanation." The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Before she could gather her wits, before she could formulate another question, another plea, he slid into the car, and the driver shut the door behind him with a soft, final thud. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, its taillights disappearing into the night, leaving Clara standing alone on the sidewalk, stunned, breathless, and utterly devastated. She had so many questions, a torrent of unanswered inquiries swirling in her mind. But only one thought echoed, a haunting refrain, in the sudden silence: who was this man? And what was he hiding? Clara stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching the black car vanish into the inky abyss of the night. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and confusion. Her breath came in short, uneven bursts, each exhale a whispered plea for understanding. The billionaire's words echoed in her mind, a cold, dismissive mantra: "I don't owe you an explanation." But he did. He ABD. If he possessed a photograph of her mother, tucked away in the secret recesses of his wallet, there was a reason. A reason that had been hidden for years, a reason that was now consuming her with an unquenchable fire. She was going to find out what it was, no matter the cost. Turning back toward the diner, she pushed open the heavy glass door, the bell above jingling with a hollow, mocking cheerfulness. The night shift cook, Danny, a burly man with kind eyes, gave her a curious glance from the kitchen window, flipping a burger on the grill. "You okay, Clara?" he called out, his voice laced with concern. Clara barely managed a nod, a feeble attempt to reassure him that everything was all right. But everything was far from all right. As she walked past him, heading for the cramped back room, she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She needed air. She needed to think. She needed to understand. Leaning against the cool, unforgiving metal of the storage shelves, she closed her eyes, her mind racing, piecing together fragments of memories, searching for clues in the shadows of her past. Her mother had passed away 5 years ago, a sudden, cruel stroke that had stolen her life, leaving Clara alone in the world. There had been no long-lost friends, no mysterious figures at the funeral, just a few of her mother's co-workers from the community clinic and some quiet neighbors. Nothing. Absolutely nothing to suggest that she had ever known someone as powerful, as wealthy, as utterly untouchable as the man who had just walked out of the diner and out of her life. Or so he thought. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, trying to control the overwhelming flood of emotions. She had always believed she knew everything about her mother. They had been each other's world, a small, self-contained universe of love and support. But what if she had been wrong? What if there was a hidden past, a secret history, a part of her mother's life that she had deliberately kept hidden? Her gaze fell on her purse, sitting forgotten on the small break table. She grabbed it, her fingers fumbling with the zipper. Pulling out her phone, she quickly searched for billionaire CEOs in the city. It didn't take long to find him. His name was Richard Thornton, owner of a massive real estate empire, a man worth billions. Clara stared at his picture on the screen, her stomach twisting with a mixture of fear and anticipation. His eyes, the same piercing blue she had seen just moments ago, seemed to bore into her, accusing her of something she didn't even understand. Why would someone like him, a titan of industry, a man who lived in a world of private jets and glittering galas, have a picture of a woman who had worked as a nurse in a small, underfunded community clinic? The two of them couldn't have been from more different worlds. A sinking feeling settled in her chest, a cold, heavy weight that threatened to drag her down into the depths of despair. She had to find out the truth. She had to. The next morning, fueled by a restless night and a burning need for answers, she made a decision. She wasn't going to sit back and let this mystery eat away at her, consuming her from the inside out. She wasn't going to allow Richard Thornton to dismiss her, to treat her like she was insignificant. She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to start. Clara took the first bus downtown, gripping her bag tightly as she stared out the window. The city blurred past in a chaotic swirl of concrete and steel, a reflection of the turmoil that raged within her. She had spent the entire night searching for information, devouring every article, every interview, every scrap of detail she could find about Richard Thornton. She had discovered that his company headquarters was located in one of the tallest buildings in the city, a gleaming skyscraper that seemed to Thornton the very heavens. It wasn't far now. She could be there in less than 20 minutes. Her mind buzzed with questions, a relentless swarm of anxieties and uncertainties. What would she say? What would she do? Would he even see her? As she approached the skyscraper, its sheer size and opulence dwarfing everything around it, she felt a wave of intimidation wash over her. This was his world, a world of unimaginable wealth and power. What chance did she, a struggling waitress from a small-town diner, have against him? The moment she stepped inside the lobby, she felt hopelessly out of place. The space was massive, a cathedral of polished marble and gleaming chrome, filled with well-dressed professionals who barely spared her a glance. She walked up to the reception desk, trying to steady her nerves, to project an air of confidence she didn't feel. The woman behind the counter, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit that probably cost more than Clara's entire wardrobe, glanced up at her with a polite but distant smile. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" Clara's throat went dry. She had no plan, no excuse, no real strategy. Just a burning need for answers, the unwavering determination to uncover the truth about her mother's past. I need to see Richard Thornton," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The receptionist's polite smile didn't falter, but her expression cooled perceptibly. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Thornton doesn't take walk-in meetings." "Do you have an appointment?" Clara hesitated, her mind scrambling for a believable lie. But she couldn't. She just couldn't. "No," she admitted, her voice laced with desperation. "But it's important. It's personal." The woman's fingers tapped lightly against the polished surface of the desk, a subtle indication of her impatience. "Unfortunately, Mr. Thornton's schedule is full. If you'd like, I can direct you to our corporate inquiry department." "No," Clara said quickly, shaking her head. "I just need a few minutes." The receptionist shook her head, her expression firm. "I'm afraid that won't be possible." Clara's heart sank, the weight of her failure pressing down on her. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm, to think clearly. She wasn't leaving without answers. And if she couldn't get in the right way, she'd find another way. Stepping away from the reception desk, she forced herself to stay calm, to observe, to strategize. She could feel the receptionist's eyes on her, waiting for her to leave, to admit defeat. But she had no intention of walking out empty-handed. She had come too far. She had risked too much. There had to be another way inside. Her gaze darted around the lobby, taking in every detail, searching for an opportunity. Security guards stood near the elevators, their sharp eyes scanning the room, alert and watchful. Employees with badges hurried in and out, swiping their cards at the turnstiles, their faces etched with purpose. She needed a way past them, a way to blend in, to disappear into the anonymity of the corporate world. Then, she spotted him. A young man in a crisp, impeccably tailored suit, holding a steaming coffee cup in one hand and balancing a thick folder under his arm. He looked harried and distracted, his attention focused on his phone. As he walked toward the elevators, his brow furrowed in concentration, he seemed completely oblivious to the world around him. Without thinking, Clara moved quickly, falling into step beside him. Just as he reached the security checkpoint, she spoke in a confident whisper, hoping she sounded like she belonged, like she was part of this world. "Hey, wait up. You forgot to send me that report Mr. Thornton wanted." The man glanced at her, confusion etched on his face. "What?" Clara gave him an exasperated look, hoping she sounded convincing, like a disgruntled colleague. "The report he was expecting this morning. The one from accounting? He's been asking about it all day." The man hesitated, his brows drawing together in a frown. "Oh, I..." Before he could finish, she smoothly stepped ahead, as if she belonged, walking right through the turnstiles as his badge activated the sensor. The guard barely glanced at her, assuming she was with him, part of the same team. She kept moving, forcing herself to breathe normally, to maintain her composure. "Don't look back. Don't hesitate. Just keep moving." The elevator doors slid open, and she stepped inside, her heart pounding in her ears. She pressed the button for the top floor, the highest level of the skyscraper, the floor that housed Richard Thornton's office. As the doors shut, sealing her inside the metal box, she released a shaky breath. She had done it. She had bluffed her way past security. She was one step closer to the truth. The ride felt endless, each floor that passed only amplifying her anxiety. What would she say when she saw Richard Thornton again? Would he be furious? Would he call security and have her thrown out? Would he finally, after all these years, tell her the truth? When the doors finally opened, she stepped into a sleek, modern office space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the city. Everything screamed wealth and power, from the expensive artwork on the walls to the hushed whispers of the assistants who sat at their desks, typing away with focused intensity. Clara took a tentative step forward, her shoes clicking softly on the polished floor. But before she could get far, a voice stopped her in her tracks. "Excuse me, miss." She turned to see a tall, imposing man in a dark suit approaching her, his sharp gaze flickering over her, assessing her, evaluating her. "You're not supposed to be up here. Do you have an appointment with Mr. Thornton?" Clara's throat tightened, her carefully constructed facade crumbling around her. She could lie, could try to concoct another elaborate story, but she doubted it would work. These people were trained to spot deception and to identify imposters. So she did the only thing she could. She told the truth. "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need to see him. It's about my mother." The man's expression didn't change, remaining impassive, unreadable. "Mr. Thornton is in a meeting." "Then I'll wait," she said firmly, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a desperate hope that he would listen, that he would understand. The assistant gave her a long, considering look as if weighing her options. Then, with a barely perceptible sigh, he exhaled. "Wait here." He turned and disappeared down a long hallway, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she stood there, alone and uncertain, wondering what would happen next. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each second a ticking bomb of anxiety. Then, suddenly, a door opened at the far end of the office, and Richard Thornton himself stepped out. The moment his eyes landed on her, something flickered in his expression, something she couldn't quite place. Surprise? Anger? Recognition? But instead of looking surprised or angry, he looked resigned. He walked toward her, his hands in his pockets, his movements slow and deliberate. "You just don't give up, do you?" he said quietly, his voice laced with a hint of weariness. Clara's fists clenched at her sides, her knuckles white. "Not when it comes to my mother." A long silence followed, broken only by the distant hum of the city. Then, finally, he spoke. "Come with me." Without another word, without another glance at the curious assistants who were now openly staring at them, he turned and walked back into his office. Clara hesitated for only a second before following him inside. She was finally, after all these years, about to get the answers she had been desperately searching for. Or so she hoped. Clara stepped into Richard Thornton's office, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the luxurious space. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the room in golden sunlight, offering a breathtaking view of the sprawling city below. A massive mahogany desk sat in the center, meticulously organized, its surface gleaming with a polished sheen. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with expensive, leather-bound volumes, each one a testament to wealth and power. It was the kind of office that belonged to a man who controlled empires, a man who lived in a world far removed from her own. Richard walked to his desk and leaned against it, crossing his arms, studying her with a look that sent a shiver down her spine. There was something unreadable in his expression, something deep and conflicted, a hidden struggle playing out behind his steely gaze. Clara swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice, to project an air of confidence she didn't feel. "Why do you have my mother's picture?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. He exhaled, rubbing a hand wearily over his face as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "No," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. For a moment, he was silent, his eyes locked on hers, searching, probing. Then, with a sigh of resignation, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Clara's pulse quickened as he carefully took out the same worn photograph she had seen last night, the photograph that had turned her world upside down. He held it between his fingers, staring at it for a long moment, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. Then, without a word, he turned it around for her to see. Clara's throat tightened as she looked at the picture again. Her mother was younger, radiant, her eyes sparkling with laughter. But now, as she looked closer, something struck her, something she hadn't noticed before, something that sent a jolt of recognition through her. She pointed to the edge of the photograph, where a small corner was torn away, leaving a jagged edge. This picture, it's incomplete. There was someone else in it. Richard nodded slowly, his expression grave. Yes. Someone very important. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat of anticipation and fear. Who? For the first time, his voice softened, losing its edge of indifference. Me. She felt the air leave her lungs, a sudden vacuum that threatened to suffocate her. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the expensive furniture and breathtaking view blurring around her. She stared at him, trying to process what he had just said, trying to make sense of the impossible. That doesn't make sense, she whispered, her voice trembling. But as she looked at him, really looked at him, she saw it. The faint familiarity in his features, the subtle curve of his jaw, the way his eyes, though hardened by time and experience, held a spark of something she had seen before. A painful realization settled over her, a cold, heavy weight that threatened to crush her. You knew my mother, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words laden with unspoken questions. Richard let out a breath, a sigh that seemed to release years of pent-up guilt and regret. I loved her. Clara staggered back a step, her mind reeling. What? His gaze didn't waver, his eyes locked on hers, unflinching. Your mother and I, we were once everything to each other. Clara's mind spun, a chaotic vortex of disbelief and confusion. This was impossible. Her mother had never spoken about him, had never mentioned anything about a man like Richard Thornton, a billionaire, a man with power beyond imagination. I don't believe you, she said, shaking her head, trying to dispel the impossible reality that was unfolding before her. Richard reached into his desk and pulled out a small, old envelope, yellowed with age. He handed it to her, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest of seconds. Clara hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, slowly, cautiously, she opened it. Inside was another photograph. This time, a complete one, the torn corner restored, revealing the full image. And there they were. Her mother was younger, and more vibrant than she had ever seen her, her face radiating pure joy. And beside her, a much younger Richard Thornton, his arm around her, his hand resting casually on her waist, smiling in a way she had never imagined he could smile. Tears burned at her eyes, blurring her vision. She had never seen her mother look so happy, so carefree. Who was this man? And what had he done to take that happiness away? Why, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Why didn't she tell me? Richard's jaw tightened, his face etched with pain. Because I wasn't the man I should have been. Clara looked up at him, searching his face for answers, for some explanation that would make sense of this impossible situation. What happened? His expression darkened, a shadow of regret passing over his features. I made a mistake. The kind that changes everything. She clutched the photograph, her knuckles white, her body trembling with the force of her emotions. Tell me the truth. All of it. He looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding whether she was ready, whether she could handle the weight of his confession. Then, finally, he spoke. It's time you knew who I am. And who you are. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched the photograph, her mother's smiling face staring back at her, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. The weight of Richard Thornton's words pressed down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. This man, this billionaire, was inextricably tied to her mother's past in ways she had never imagined. And now, he was about to tell her something that could change everything. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her eyes searching his for any sign of deception. Who am I? Richard hesitated, his jaw tightening as if he was bracing himself for a blow. Then, with a deep breath, he spoke the words that would shatter her world. You're my daughter. The words hit her like a thunderclap, a deafening explosion that ripped through the fragile foundations of her reality. The room blurred around her, the luxurious office, the breathtaking view, the imposing figure of Richard Thornton, all fading into a swirling vortex of disbelief. Her ears rang a high-pitched whine that drowned out the sound of her breathing. She shook her head, stepping back, trying to distance herself from the impossible truth. No. That's not possible. Richard's voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable pain behind it, a deep, abiding sadness that resonated within her. It is. I've known for years, Clara. I knew the moment I saw you at the restaurant. You look just like her. Her mind railed against the truth, desperately clinging to the familiar lies, the comforting illusions. Her mother had never once mentioned this, not hinted at the existence of a man like Richard Thornton. You're lying. He shook his head, his eyes filled with a sorrow that mirrored her own. I wish I were. Clara felt her knees weaken, her body threatening to collapse under the weight of the revelation. But she refused to let herself fall. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. If this was true, if this impossible reality was real, then she deserved to know the whole story, the unvarnished truth. If this is true, why didn't she ever tell me? Why didn't you ever try to find me? Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping with defeat. Because I failed her. I failed both of you. Her chest ached, a hollow emptiness that threatened to consume her. What did you do? He ran a hand over his face, his expression tormented as if reliving a nightmare. Your mother and I, we were in love. Young, reckless, idealistic. But I was ambitious. I wanted more power, more success, more money. My family disapproved of her. They told me that if I stayed with her, I would lose everything. And like a fool, I listened to them. Clara's breath caught in her throat, a silent gasp of disbelief. You walked away, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words laced with bitterness. He nodded, his expression filled with regret. I left her when she needed me most. I thought I was making the right decision. I thought I could come back later when I had built the life I wanted. But by the time I realized what I had done, it was too late. She was gone. Clara's vision blurred with unshed tears, the pain of his confession echoing the pain she had felt at her mother's death. She left because of you. Richard nodded, his expression filled with a guilt that had haunted him for years. I searched for her for years, but she didn't want to be found. She wanted to protect you from me, from the kind of life I had built. Clara's throat tightened, her heart aching with a pain she had never known. You abandoned her. You abandoned me. His eyes darkened with a searing pain, a glimpse into the private hell he had created for himself. I did. And I have spent every day since regretting it. A long silence filled the room, the air between them heavy with the weight of everything unsaid, everything unforgiven. Clara clenched her fists, her emotions warring inside her, a chaotic battle between anger and grief, between resentment and a desperate longing for connection. She had spent her entire life struggling, watching her mother work herself to the bone to provide for them, sacrificing everything for her daughter's happiness. Meanwhile, Richard Thornton had lived in luxury, surrounded by wealth and power, never once knowing the pain they had endured, never once acknowledging his responsibility. She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand why he had let this happen, why he had chosen ambition over love, why he had condemned them both to a life of hardship and loneliness. Instead, she asked the only question that mattered, the question that had been gnawing at her soul for years. Why now? Richard stepped closer, his voice raw with emotion. Because I don't want to make the same mistake again. I lost your mother. I can't lose you too. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic plea for reason, for understanding. She had spent her whole life wondering about the father she had never known, imagining him as a hero, a Prince Charming who would one day rescue her from her mundane existence. Now, he stood before her, not as a hero, but as a flawed, broken man, asking for a second chance. But could she give it to him? Could she forgive him for the pain he had caused? Could she trust him with her heart? Clara stood frozen, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had spent years wondering why her mother had been so secretive about the past, why there had always been a sadness in her eyes whenever Clara asked about her father. Now, the truth stood before her, larger than life, an undeniable force that threatened to overwhelm her. Richard Thornton, a billionaire, a man who had abandoned the woman he claimed to love, and now he wanted something from her. He wanted forgiveness. He wanted connection. He wanted what? She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. You think you can just walk into my life after all these years and expect me to forgive you? Richard's gaze didn't waver, his eyes locked on hers, filled with a desperate plea for understanding. No. I don't expect that. But I have to try. Clara shook her head, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on her, threatening to suffocate her. Do you even understand what my mother and I went through? Do you know how hard she worked just to keep us afloat? She gave up everything. And you had everything. His jaw tightened, his expression darkening, but not with anger, with something deeper, more profound. Remorse. Regret. Guilt. I know. And I will never be able to make up for what I did. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, a sound filled with years of pent-up pain and resentment. So why are you here? Guilt? Regret? You think throwing money at me is going to fix this? Richard's expression darkened further, but not with anger, with something more complex, more nuanced. A silent acknowledgement of his failures, a deep understanding of the chasm that separated them. This isn't about money, he said, his voice low and intense. It never was. Clara scoffed, her voice laced with sarcasm. Easy for you to say when you have more than you could ever spend. He sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, a rare display of vulnerability. I can't change the past, Clara. But I can give you the future you deserve. Her stomach twisted, the words a tempting promise and a hollow echo of what could have been. You think I need your help? I think you deserve the choice, he said softly, his eyes filled with desperate hope. Your mother wanted to protect you from me. I understand that. But she also kept you from knowing the truth. You were never unwanted. You were never forgotten. I loved your mother, and I would have loved you if I had known. Clara's breath hitched, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling around her. She wanted to hold on to her anger, to push him away, to protect herself from further pain. But there was something in his voice, something raw and broken, that resonated within her. And for the first time, she saw it. Regret. The kind that never fades, the kind that eats away at your soul, leaving you forever haunted by what could have been. She looked down at the photograph in her hands, her mother's radiant smile, Richard's protective arm around her, a stolen moment in time that had shattered into a million pieces. Tears burned her eyes, blurring her vision, and making it hard to breathe. She's gone, she whispered, her voice cracking with grief. And she will never know you said that. His voice cracked, a whisper of remorse that echoed the pain in her own heart. I know. Silence stretched between them, a chasm filled with unspoken words, unfulfilled promises, and the ghosts of a love that had been lost too soon. Finally, Clara let out a shaky breath, a sign of surrender, a tentative step toward forgiveness. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. Richard nodded slowly, accepting her words without argument, without expectation. I don't expect you to. But I will spend the rest of my life proving that I am not the same man who walked away all those years ago. She searched his face, looking for deception, for selfishness, for any sign that he was still the same man who had abandoned her mother. But all she saw was a man who had lost something precious, something he could never get back. And for the first time, she realized, so had she. Her voice was barely a whisper, a fragile plea for hope. I don't know where to start. Richard's lips pressed together, a silent acknowledgement of the long and difficult road ahead. Then, carefully, he reached into his desk and pulled out a small, velvet box, its surface worn smooth with age. He placed it gently in front of her, a silent offering of reconciliation. Clara frowned, her brow furrowed with confusion. What is this? A gift, he said softly, his voice filled with a tenderness she had never expected. From your mother. She left it with me years ago. She told me to give it to you when the time was right. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm of anticipation and fear. With trembling fingers, she lifted the lid, revealing the contents within. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a delicate silver necklace, its chain shimmering in the sunlight. Suspended from the chain was a small, intricately engraved pendant, its surface gleaming with a soft, ethereal light. And engraved on the pendant, in elegant cursive script, were 3 simple words, a message from the past, a beacon of hope for the future. Forgive. Love. Begin. A sob caught in her throat, a release of years of pent-up emotion. The dam of her carefully constructed defenses finally broke, and the tears flowed freely, washing away the anger, the resentment, the fear, leaving behind a fragile seed of hope. Richard's voice was hoarse, filled with a pain that mirrored her own. She believed in second chances. Clara clenched the necklace in her hand, her mother's words echoing in her mind, a whisper from beyond the grave, urging her to let go of the past, to embrace the possibility of a new beginning. Maybe, just maybe, she could too.